Assimilation. The issue of assimilation against First Nations people is an issue that has just recently begun changing for the better. The first Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, brought the Aboriginal assimilation policy to Canada. It was put to action with lawmaking that designed and forced non-Indigenous educational systems, social policies, and economic developments on Aboriginal peoples in order to extinguish Indigenous rights, culture, and infrastructure. The reason the Canadian government forced assimilation onto the Aboriginal peoples was in order to annex the Indigenous lands and resources and further colonize Canada. Canada was built on the point that Indigenous peoples were not seen in the future of Canada. Some assimilation tools that were used in the past include unfulfilled treaties that deny Indigenous rights, excluding Indigenous rights in legislation, the Indian Act, cultural genocide from residential schools and welfare agencies, selective funding and infrastructure development to support non-Indigenous development of civilization, abuse of power. Indigenous peoples still don't have major parts of their infrastructure. They have all been completely or partially destroyed. These include trade and commerce, traditional food, resource management, justice, education, health, government, and community. Indigenous people need to rebuild their infrastructure, but unfortunately, the agenda of colonization is still intact in modern-day Canada. Most of the old assimilation policies are still in place in certain forms. The modern-day high school student, or we, I don't believe play a major role in further perpetuating the issue of assimilation. In general, most people of the high school age are much more inclusive and open to new ways of life and cultural beliefs. Therefore, I don't believe the younger generation plays a role in further perpetuating the issue. But I do believe there are still some in the older generations that believe the assimilation of Aboriginal peoples was needed in order to help colonize Canada and push the country forward. Canadians can choose to learn from this issue or not. That's why Canada is such a good place to live. You get a chance to express your beliefs and choose what you want to believe in. But I believe in order to move forward on this topic, Canadians need to put more funding towards particular things on reserves, not just giving them money, and guiding the reserves on how to spend their money properly, such as a certain amount has to go into healthcare and schooling. Aboriginal communities claim there is currently inequity in education funding for First Nations students on reserves, but in reality, they receive more funding than normal public school students. They receive around $13,500 per student on reserves, and it's around $11,700 per Ontario public school student. So where is that money going, you may ask? Ask the Aboriginal communities, as they determine where the education funding dollars are spent. I believe with monitoring from the government on where the money from taxpayers is going, the money would be used more responsibly and in ways that are beneficial to not only to the education of the younger population, but also in rehabilitation of the older population still recovering from the laws of assimilation and the residential schools. And I believe that is what the Canadian government can do to further help in the recovery process, not giving more money or continuing to apologize over and over again, but helping guide the communities to smart use of the money they receive.